We are covering the national portion of the real estate exam, specifically focusing on environmental site assessments, or ESAs, which play a critical role in the due diligence process for commercial and industrial properties. On your exam, you need to distinguish clearly between a Phase 1 and a Phase 2 assessment, because examiners love to swap the definitions to trick you. A Phase 1 environmental site assessment is essentially a historical research project combined with a visual inspection. During a Phase 1 assessment, the professional is reviewing government records, looking for old underground storage tanks, and conducting a physical walkthrough of the property to spot signs of contamination, like oil stains or distressed vegetation. It is vital to remember for the exam that a Phase 1 assessment never involves actual sampling or testing of the soil or groundwater. If an exam question mentions taking a core sample or testing a well, you are no longer in Phase 1 territory. That brings us to the Phase 2 environmental site assessment, which is only triggered if the Phase 1 report identifies what we call recognized environmental conditions, or RECs. Phase 2 is where the physical testing happens. This involves boring into the ground to collect soil samples and monitoring groundwater for chemical pollutants or hazardous substances. One common exam trap is a question asking if a Phase 1 is required for every residential transaction. It is not. These assessments are standard for commercial properties, but the exam will test your knowledge of how they interact with federal law, specifically the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, or CERCLA. Under CERCLA, property owners can be held strictly liable for cleaning up hazardous waste, even if they did not cause the contamination. This is why the environmental site assessment is so important for your clients. By performing a Phase 1 assessment before closing, a buyer is exercising due diligence to establish the innocent landowner defense. If they perform the assessment and it comes back clean, and later a hidden barrel of toxic waste is found, they may be shielded from liability because they did their homework. You should think of the mnemonic Phase 1 is for the eyes, while Phase 2 is for the samples, to keep the distinction clear in your mind. Another trick the exam uses involves the role of the real estate agent in this process. Your job is not to conduct the assessment or interpret the technical scientific data yourself, but rather to advise your client that an assessment may be necessary and to recommend qualified professionals. You will likely see a question where a buyer asks if a property is safe, and the correct answer usually involves recommending a Phase 1 assessment rather than the agent giving a personal opinion on the soil quality. Remember that strict liability means the government does not care who is at fault. They only care who currently owns the deed. This creates a chain of liability that can only be broken by the documented due diligence provided by these assessments. If a Phase 2 confirms contamination, the buyer will likely use that information to either negotiate a lower price, walk away from the deal, or require the seller to remediate the site before the transfer of title. Focus on the fact that Phase 1 is non-invasive and Phase 2 is invasive, because that simple distinction will help you navigate several difficult questions on the national exam. Furthermore, the exam might ask about the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, by its nickname, the Superfund. You need to know that this law created a tax on the chemical and petroleum industries and provided broad federal authority to respond to releases of hazardous substances. The concept of joint and several liability is also a major exam point, which means that any one of the previous or current owners can be held responsible for the entire cost of the cleanup, regardless of their percentage of contribution to the mess. This makes the Phase 1 assessment the only real shield a buyer has. If the exam asks what the primary purpose of a Phase 1 is, the answer is usually to establish due diligence or to identify recognized environmental conditions. Do not be confused by questions that suggest a Phase 1 guarantees the land is clean. It only states that no evidence of contamination was found during the specific scope of that investigation. The difference between an inspection and an assessment is also a point of confusion. In the context of the exam, an assessment is a broader professional evaluation, while an inspection might be a more limited look at a specific component, like a lead paint check. By keeping your focus on the distinction between the visual nature of Phase 1 and the invasive testing of Phase 2, You will be well prepared for any environmental questions that come your way on the national portion of the exam.